Hello, everyone. We are going to be having a great conversation in over the next 45 minutes or so. I'm Tom Sherrington, and Bron, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Bron. I'm an instructional leader and a teacher by background in Melbourne. Super keen to talk to you, Tom, and shoot the breeze about all things teaching and everything else.
Yeah, so we've worked out that we do almost exactly the same work, albeit in different with different schools, different countries, but we have so much overlap in what we're trying to do and the way we think about teaching. So we thought it would be great to just exchange our perspectives on what we find. So do you want to kick off? You've set some questions up. So do you want to just kick off asking them, and then we'll get into it?
Yeah. Yeah, Tom, I've followed your work for a long time, big fan of all your walkthrough stuff. And when I read your blog, when you read a blog and it feels like putting on a nice tracksuit with someone saying all the things that you think. Absolutely love your work. And so I'd love to kick off asking you a question about responsive teaching. That makes up the bulk of the work that I do with schools, looking at responsive instruction. I'm keen to know, what do you love about it? Like, what has led you to do so much work in that area? I think the walkthrough series is really just codifying a heap of stuff around responsive teaching. But what do you love about it?
I think it's because over the years I've been working with teachers in my own schools, but then visiting schools as a external trainer consultant. I've just felt that the things that come up as issues for where there are gaps, where there's mileage in improving, which I think makes a difference. It's just in the classroom, and it's in the territory of responsiveness. So, and particularly when you're thinking about it being responding to all the students in a class. And so what I
Yeah.
feel is that teachers expend a lot of energy, and schools do, on sort of what I would say marginal issues,
Hmm.
when
Yeah.
there's so much material, just getting the stuff right day to day. So that's what I feel. I feel like if we can improve responsive teaching as a total focus, so many other things would benefit, and it's just the heart. It feels like it's the
Yeah.
core of where the challenges lie. So I find that's where
Yeah.
it's sort of interesting to explore.
Yeah. Um, it's also like, if you've been a teacher by background, you just know that it's the hardest thing.
Mm,
Like, I think the other thing that why I love talking to teachers about responsive teaching is because there's just not a teacher on the planet who thinks that's an easy part of the job. Some parts of the job are kind of quite procedural and administrative.
mm.
Um, and responding to the kids in the room is always, just by far, I think, the hardest thing in your day. It's
Yeah,
like
completely. And it's sort of,
tracking how it's going for them.
yeah,
Like,
it's a question you think it's just a really hard question. So you're sort of, I'm thinking of the last time I taught some stuff, which was a kind of a day of with a class I didn't know, but it was a kind of catch up day on physics, so quite a lot of content, and I didn't know the students. I'm walking into the
yeah,
room thinking, straight away, I'm thinking, this isn't just about me like blasting stuff out, because
yeah,
straight away you're thinking, oh, okay, you kind of know this, but you're really struggling, and you don't seem
yeah,
to talk very much, and you talk way too much. And so,
yeah, yeah,
right, okay, so I need to get some dynamics going here that allows me to interact with you, and that's the I've been doing this for years, but this isn't easy. I have to work it. I have to
yeah. I
relentlessly
feel
challenge
tired just listening to you describe that scene. Like, I need a glass of wine just listening to that scene.
it.
Like, who the hell are these people? What are they thinking? What's in your head? What do you know? What's your personality like? How likely are you to answer this question if I ask you directly?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. And it's sort of, and then there are lots of people who've explored this before, like, you know, legends of the world, like of our world, like Dylan William, who's been
mm,
describing this
yeah,
for decades.
yeah,
And, all sorts of things like the impact of feedback on a student, and the fact that
yeah,
you can kind of make them kind of coast with complacency by being sort of too gentle, but another student, if you're too harsh, you sort of crush them, demotivate
Yeah,
them that
yeah,
way. So that subtle interplay of like, how do you even respond to the kind of message I'm giving? But
yeah.
mainly, I feel like it's even just like gathering the information. So how
Oh,
do I know how you're doing? And what I'm so interested in at the moment is the kind of, you do have to make that complexity into something reasonably procedural, because otherwise you just can't do it at all. So the way we sort of craft techniques to deal with that.
yeah. You mean
I'm
for
so interested in.
teachers, you have to make the procedural steps of the technique, you mean, for teachers, quite
Yeah.
clear. Yeah.
So, and this is another reason I'm interested in it, is weirdly, it's just not embedded in teachers' habits very often that to do this. So a lot
But
of
then I
teachers,
don't, yeah, I'm less surprised by that though, because I've worked in teacher education, like first at RMIT University and then University of Melbourne.
yeah,
And this is not a criticism of like either of those institutions, but it is a staggeringly small amount of time that we spend in pre-service, teacher preparation, talking at that level. And so it's kind of hardly surprising to me that we then get out into the field and you just have a crack at stuff. And of course, it's not well thought through and coherent and effective. You know
yeah, I
what I
guess
mean?
you're
Like,
right. I
think
mean,
back to my graduate years, and I'm like, what was I doing? And then it's not till you've been taught for 4 or 5 years that you've got frustrated enough by something that's not working, that through trial and error or like happening upon a great resource, that you go, oh, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. And you try and kind of unstitching habits from that point, right?
absolutely. And well,
Mm,
I'm trying to think of the first time I ever was introduced to, say, mini whiteboards, and it
yeah.
felt like quite a new thing. Even though, even when we had them, we were laughing at how old-fashioned they seemed to be. But it wasn't part of my training to sort of get responses from the students all at the same time, or even to make sure you circulate really actively around the room and check how kids are doing. It was sort of, yeah, and I meet a lot of teachers whose like deep default habit is to stand at the front and
Mm.
just sort of stuff wing stuff out and hope that people are kind of making sense of it without really checking, and they're just sort of going, oh, and
But
it's
and that's all like wrapped up in like well, for me, like, and I'm interested in, like, I want to ask you about which kinds of responsive teaching techniques do you think you find that teachers find most challenging? Because sometimes I think we can get good at breaking the technique down and we can present it to teachers, and it makes total sense, but we don't realize that there's an existing habit that is a barrier to implementing that well. So like an example for me, a massive habit that I had that was completely ingrained was that I asked every single question by saying, who can tell me? And then I would try and shoehorn cold call into that. So I ran a choir and there were 90 kids in it. And I would say, okay, 4 to 6 choir, who can tell me what breath control means? We talked about that last week. And I can tell you, out of the 90 kids that were in that choir, the 5 kids who would put their hand up, I can still name them, I can still see them. And then I would say, well, wait for more people to think. And then I would try and shoehorn in a cold call. And then the kid would say, well, you didn't ask me. And it was all like not working because I had this existing
yeah.
habit that I was trying to kind of, so I'm interested in that as well. Like, even
I
if
think
we
that's
get,
I think that's a really common one. I mean, I would say that is one of the most,
yeah,
just that simple thing. It's like sort of baseline. Who can tell me? And getting an answer. So I think that psychology of a teacher, which is an answer has been said, that's kind of it. Like I ask a question
yeah,
and an answer has, and even sort of ones where you might ask more than one. So if I asked you, what are the 3 primary colors or something, and there are only 3, you might give me red, and then I'll go to someone else for blue and someone else for yellow. And between us, we've come up with the 3. But I didn't even, on my own question, I didn't even say, come on, Bron, what are the other 2? Sort of that type of
yeah,
thing. Between us, we know, and away we go. And it's that type of thing. And I feel like that type of loop. Now, to unpick that and to think, now what's the problem with that? Why is that not a good way to do it?
Yeah, I think the other thing that I'm interested in is like when I talk to teachers about that habit, because I often have to front load and say, don't go home crying if you realize that this is how you ask questions, because in a room full of 100 teachers, you can have often 85 will put their hand up and go, yeah, that's me. That's how I ask questions. And then we dig into that. And I think what I've found in conversation with teachers is that we think that when we say, who can tell me, that we're switching kids on to thinking. And I actually think we're switching 95% of them off. I think they're waiting to hear us say, who can tell me? And then the kids are like, that's when Tom and Vanessa and Jason speak now. And I sit here and I wait for this to be over.
Totally.
So it's like seeing it through the eyes of the student who opts out. All of a sudden it becomes totally obvious that when I ask the question is when the exact moment when they turn off to thinking.
I think this is one of these things I've learnt, from observing lessons. So, I observe lots of lessons, and one of the things I always have to say is, it's a piece of cake to watch a lesson compared to teach a lesson. So when I'm describing all this stuff, it's a bit like, watching sport when you, as a punter, you can be sort of yelling at the screen saying, pass it now, or why didn't you do that? And it doesn't mean I could go in down there and do it. So I think that's the same with a lot of teaching. I think it's easier to say than to do. So you're sort of, not trying to be judgmental about it, but what I've observed a lot in lessons is to sort of, I've learned to sit back and just sort of imagine what it's like to be in this seat in this lesson all the time, and how teachers interact with that space or those children. And you notice that teachers have all sorts of habits around who they ask, how often they come around that space, and the fact that a few children can dominate a lesson quite easily and create the feeling that stuff is being exchanged and shared, but then quite a lot of the children that you're looking at are just not saying anything and have, like you say, switched off. And so that to me is why the responsive teaching agenda, I just think, is so important, because you're thinking, this is a mantra I use a lot at the moment, is that child matters as much as any of the others. So if you're trying to teach them, imagine if they were the only kid in the room. You wouldn't just ignore them or wave at them and say, is everything fine? You would want to know how they were getting on. And just because there's loads of other kids in the room, their learning is still the same for them. So you've got to thinking, if your instinct is to engage on one-to-one with somebody, well, why aren't you trying to engage with all of them? And it's a kind of, whoa, okay, so that's not easy, but that is what we should be trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it isn't easy. It isn't easy though. So I guess I'm wondering what are some of the techniques that you think are kind of hardest to get going on the ground? I mean, I'm sure we see like lots of similar things in our travels, but what do you find are kind of the things that schools are really sort of committed to and are trying, but that are really difficult to implement well?
I think just the simple cold calling is one, I'd say, and think, pair, share. So these are two techniques which I feel like are kind of a good counterpart to each other. One of them is everyone is thinking and ready to answer, and the other one is everyone's talking. And both of them you can do really well, or kind of not very well at all. So with cold calling, it depends where your source is. So if you read Teach Like a Champion, where Doug Lemov kind of has kind of popularized that term, it's not exactly the way we describe it in walkthroughs. So I feel like you do have to say, well, which version are you talking about?
Yeah.
So in my version, it includes following up questions with each student and always asking at least one other student the same question, not a new one. So sort of, and so if I'm looking at it, I'm thinking even the very first part of it is to ask the question so that everyone feels asked, and pause a bit to check. And even that I find is really hard to shift a habit on. Okay, so what are the three primary colors? Everyone have a think. Can you see if you can remember them? Like, pause. and waiting, and then creating the feeling that, yeah, I could ask anyone. And that to me, even getting to that stage for some teachers is a big habit shift. I mean, do you find the same?
I do. In that example you just gave, actually, I think if teachers haven't established cold calling as a practice and the kids aren't used to it, and if a teacher's shifting off kind of having said, who can tell me one of the primary colours, and waiting for, 5 kids to put their hand up. If they're in that position and they're trying to move to cold call, I often find ditching the question altogether very helpful, because the question is enmeshed in their habit. They have the habit of asking the question. So I have found that what they need to do is stop asking the question and say, okay, year 7, you all know this. I'm going to give you a moment to think about the 3 primary colours. Everybody thinking, hands down, right? So because the hands come up. So the thing is, I'm kind of obsessed with thinking about getting something going that's new and better, but doing it in light of what my existing practice is. And I think cold call is a good example where actually the question is the bit that the teacher's used to doing. So I often find re-scripting for statements and just telling the kids to think, and maybe saying, in a moment, I'm going to ask a few of you to share. Might want to jot some down if you need to, I still haven't asked a question.
So you sort of like direct their thinking, and then
tell them to think.
About to come. That's quite clever. Yeah, I like that. I'm gonna write that down.
So I often say with cold call, there needn't be a question.
Yeah, interesting.
Because the posing of I'm convinced that the posing of the question is this kind of it is the moment when kids have learned to switch off to thinking.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then so I mean, what you're trying to do is activate thinking and get them all ready and make them feel it. I mean, and one of the things I feel though is that this is where in implementation in a school, you often get a bit bogged down in transition from what I'm doing now to what I'm going to be doing later. And so that has special challenges compared to what it's like when it's become a routine. So once you've, and this is, I mean, someone like a Bradley Bush is brilliant at sort of sharing the research on this, but when it's studied, people, you sort of have to trust this is true. If you keep going for 3 or 4 weeks, they'll become normal. But that initial, it's a bit awkward. And but I feel like
at my school, we had in our, I don't know, we've been open for 3 years, and I would have run 7 to 8 whole staff PLs on cold call. We just continually PLing in it. And in about at the 6-month mark, our teachers developed sentence frames for themselves, and they magnetized them and they laminated them and they had them on their board. And it said, in a moment, I'm going to ask ... everybody thinking ... hands down ... just to help them transition across. Because they just couldn't, but when I was learning to do it, I used to ask the question and then say, I'm so sorry, that's not what I wanted to say. I used to just say to the kids, no, that's not what I wanted to say. Sorry, take that back. And the kids are looking at me like, oh, she's having a moment.
But I do think so. One of the things that I think this common ground here is this need to sort of articulate and explore explicitly with teachers this sort of, how am I going to make the shift in my habit? So what am I going to say to myself or to the students, which is going to push me back? And it could be every aspect of it, like how much time you're going to give them to wait, the STEM. And I think one of the other challenges, and often the reason why teachers don't like this technique, is when it lands, is how you ask a child so that they don't feel under too much pressure. So another a common challenge, and this is probably the number one issue, that when I talk to people about why are you finding cold calling hard, they'll say, because I'm so anxious about the children who aren't confident to respond. And I didn't used to like it when I was at school, and it's all about anxiety, comes up all the time. So scripting things like, so Bron, how did you get on? What were you thinking? Rather than saying, come on then, Bron, give me your answer now. It's sort of things like, how did you get on? Did you have an answer? What were you thinking? And sort of soft questioning, which invites people in. I think that's quite a subtle thing.
Yeah, very recently, We've also realized at my school that there are two completely different kinds of cold calling that teachers are doing, and that one builds culture towards the other. So we realized, so our description of cold call is probably not unlike yours in walkthroughs, where we kind of say at my school that we want to pose a question or a statement, give time for rehearsal or thinking, usually pair share or jot something down in front of you, at least some good time to think about it. Sometimes we would give a sentence frame or a sentence scaffold to get people going in their thinking, just particularly kids who have English as an additional language. And then we would usually use language like, to make sure everyone's still listening, we'd maybe use language like, we'll get started with Tom. Tom, kick us off. Tell us a little bit what you were thinking. And then we might, so we cue to a student, but we kind of indicate that it's the beginning of a conversation.
Yeah, good.
I'm not going to you for the answer. But then we realized that that really is the form of cold call that checks for understanding, but that there's this other check for understanding that our teachers are doing, which is amazing, which is using cold call as it's not a check for understanding, but it's an opportunity to respond with a certain success rate. So let's say you've got an early years teacher and she's building the word mat on the board, and she says, okay, I'm going to say the sounds and read the word. At, mat. Your turn, everybody. At, mat. Tom, your turn. At, mat. Good job, Tom. So that's a fast cold call. There's no time for thinking, no time for rehearsal, but we counted, Grace, her name is, she's a bloody gun teacher, second year teacher. We counted 18 different kids, got an individual repetition, 100% success rate, heaps of behavior specific praise, so that then when they get cold called an hour later on something that's quite tricky, they have this kind of relationship that when my teacher calls on me, she will almost guarantee my success. Either she'll scaffold me or help me, or we're kind of thinking we actually need two separate codifications, right? Like one is like word or phoneme level for really what I call like high octane opportunity to respond, where the kid's hearing their name and being successful, and the teacher ends going, nice job, Tom. And it's like, now I'm kind of itching for the teacher to call on me, because I love participating, and like her kids are like literally on their haunches, like,
I think
I want to be called.
That sounds quite, I mean, that's a great example of, where you have to think hard about this stuff. And, I think if you confuse those two, and in some people's minds they do, they're associating that kind of slightly deeper thought thinking question with the moment where you get right, the punchy one. And the punchier one is absolutely has to be, you're going to know, I'm just checking, and it's affirmative and it's positive. And if you get those two the wrong way around, and I sort of like, it's and you haven't had time to think. So that's so interesting. And so this is why I think it's so interesting about the word responsive, is that in this one example, the point of this is, and I find that this is so interesting talking to people about, is you're gathering information so that you then decide what to do next. And often I find that's another issue, which is sort of just not attended to enough. So let's say we're doing the cold call, and even though we've done at, like, oh, we're struggling, you're not sure. Okay, quickly, like 2 out of the 5 kids I asked weren't sure. It's or whatever. You're thinking, okay, maybe we'll do it again, or do it more chorally. So you're responding to the information and then going, right, okay, what that's telling me is this. And I feel that's something which, I don't know, in our training or whatever it is, our understanding of teaching, teachers are sometimes caught out. You're thinking, well, why weren't you expecting some of them to be wrong? So what's your response? Let's assume some of the kids didn't get it. What are you going to do next? Where are the other questions? Where are the other examples? And that to me seems to be such an obvious thing to do. And yet it's often, I find teachers are caught out by it. They're just assuming that we'll just go through the process and then it will land and away we go. But yikes, guys, you're struggling with this. Okay, so like that's just that's like a panic moment.
But like the cognitive load on the teacher at that point is massive.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
it is.
like you can like smell the burn in their brain as they go, do I stop? Do I keep going, get the others to independent practice, and then I go group for instruction? Do I reteach and get everybody to redo it, even though I can see 90% of the kids can do it? Do I go my turn, your turn, and just get a choral repetition, but I'm not sure if you actually understand that? Like, there's
Yeah.
so many directions you can go. And that, I like, particularly to the novice, like when I work with recently graduated teachers, yeah,
Yeah.
like I mean, you can look at the room and you scan the mini whiteboards and half the kids are wrong and they're like, okay, wipe it, next one, because they
Yeah.
just don't know what to do.
No, I agree. And I feel like sharing this experience with people and showing how people respond and the choices that they make. And I do think this comes down to the sort of resourcing of the curriculum and
Yeah,
having a go-to place. Okay, so which is
yeah,
where when people are sort of trapped in their,
yeah,
like if you're talking about maths, for example, there are quite a lot of math schemes of which people have bought, which include slide decks, and the questions are all
yeah,
like slide by slide. But if you're finding that those students are struggling with that, I need to go offline and start saying, okay, well, let's do a couple more. And some teachers
yeah.
haven't yet learned how to just generate some questions which are similar, or it's
Yeah,
stuff
I think the
like,
other thing that makes, I'd be interested to see what you think about this, but like, I think the other thing that makes error correction really hard is that um, we often uh, sort of pussyfoot around error, right? Like, I feel like we often don't have really respectful, clear, practiced ways of saying that's wrong. So, like I've practiced with teachers before saying things like, you scan the whiteboard. Now, I've got to have in my mind, if I've got variation, I want to tell the kids that. I don't want it to be a secret,
no, no,
but I have to sort of practice what I'm going to say. So I'm going to scan the boards and then I might say something like, hey, this is interesting. We've got a few different responses here. So we're all going to learn something. Boards down, don't wipe it. Let's have a look at what we've got. And then, anonymously, I'm going to put up, my different answers and we're going to unpack them. And then I might, hopefully the kids are kind of updating their thinking. And I say, check it, change yours if you need to. Hands up if you changed your answer. Beautiful. That's what a good learner does. Good job. Like, I'm going to praise kids who are spotting their errors and like,
yeah,
but we're not practiced at that. And I watched a teacher at my school last year. They were looking at an analog time and they had to write it in digital time on their whiteboards. And there was one girl who got it wrong. And the girl who got it wrong looked at the board next to her and she looked at the board that side and she went, oh, stuff it. She knew she was wrong. Right. And what
yeah,
she had
no,
done is she'd seen the minute hand pointing, the long hand pointing to the 5, and she'd written like 50 instead of 5 past or something. I can't even remember. But the teacher had such a good culture of error that when the kids chinned their board, she picked that girl and she said, quick, come out the front, let's have a look. And she had such a good culture of error
yeah, that's great. I love that.
that the
And
girl came at the front with her wrong answer. And then she said, look at what you've got, look at the time. And then this look came over the girl's face. And she goes, oh, I see what I've done. And so she said, tell the class what you did first. Now model how to do it. And then she said, so the answer is, and the girl said 205. She said, nice job. That's the best learner. That's what a good learner does. So she had made the culture that I will always praise you if you go out on your own, but so often the kids who get it wrong, we go, oh,
and I think this is a big thing in terms of the whole issue is around. I mean, around say, like doing a quiz or any kind of checking is this exact thing of the error. So sometimes a teacher will do this if it feels logical but it doesn't work. So let's say there are 4. Let's just for speed. Let's say there are 3 questions. So I ask you question 1, question 2, question 3. There's often way more. And then what I do is I go over the questions 1. I say, okay, so the answer to question 1 is question 2, question 3, and the teacher will say, okay, so who got them all right? Well done. And the other guys, just make sure you've got your corrections down or something. And the teachers are expecting to just the children to hear the answer, self-correct, and the only people they've asked about are the ones who got them all right. And You're thinking, this little kid next to me here got those two wrong, and you just told them the right answer, but she doesn't know why, and she still doesn't understand it. So the whole process has not dealt with the
Yeah.
children who didn't get it. And the teacher will think, well, I set the quiz, I went through the answers, I was really upbeat about it. And they'll think in their head, I did a thing. But actually, it didn't reveal to you the information you needed, which was who out there doesn't know. And that mechanics of that. So how would you do that differently? You'd have to say something like, okay, so here are the answers. Right, let's have a look. Who got my favorite one? I share this quite often, but it's something like, who got 2 out of 3? Because that's great. Jessica, brilliant, well done. So which one did you get wrong? And number 4, number 2. Okay, well, so let's talk about what did you put, and we get into it because she's already, and it works better if it's like 6 questions. So you've got like 5 out of 6 is a great score. 1 wrong. Let's talk about the ones we got wrong. And which one did you get wrong? Okay, and creating a space for wrongness to be totally normal. And it's amazing how often teachers just don't do that. They're sort of just assuming the wrong people will deal with it. And I find that even the mechanics of that.
Yeah, is it that? Yeah, it could be that. I also think it could be like teachers are really protective of their kids.
Yeah,
They don't, I think they're really empathetic. I think they think some kids will go to pieces if they know that they're wrong. And I think that's probably true if we treat them like that. And by the time they get to grade 4, then they they read that off us, right? Like
yeah.
from the start of school, if we're like, God, we're all going to make mistakes. What the hell would we be doing here if we're not making mistakes? Good learners make mistakes. Let's dig into them, you know.
I know.
Then
I
I
do
think
feel
they
like
don't
as
even
teachers,
notice, but I think we make a big deal of it, so they make a big deal of it, and so they care. But I think kids are like way more robust than adults, actually. And like if we normalize it, they're fine.
well, that's the thing, the cues. I mean, I used to see this a lot in terms of this whole issue is sometimes teachers are saying, well, this is my problem because I'm worried about their anxiety. And I think, well, that's you're projecting something there. And it's a bit of a challenging thing to say to a teacher, which is like, you know, can you, it's those children could actually feel totally relaxed about it. So the reason they don't is kind of down to you. And it could be down to their previous teachers as well. But now you're responsible. You've got to be thinking, so you have to own it and make it so that it's okay to be wrong and not just say, well, that's inherently a thing of learning that it's stressful. But I do get pushback on that, and it is because in the space of teacher development, you're talking to teachers who have quite strong views and experiences. Sometimes it's their deeply held view that it's just almost sort of unethical to put a kid on the spot and ask them a question in case
Mm,
they're vulnerable. And you think, okay, well, that's a kind of strong line, but that's literally what you think. So I've got to get
yeah,
along. I've got to find out how we can move forward with that. Because if you're too scared to ask kids questions, that means you're going to avoid it. And then, wow, that's not going to make them think and da da da. So I come across
yeah,
that fairly often.
yeah. And I think that's where like cycling off the technique and coming back to the big idea is really important. Like the big idea is that you're checking that student's thinking. Now, what that looks like, I get it. There are heaps of kids who might have accommodations and adjustments, and for whatever reason, you're not going to cold call them in the way that you would cold call everybody else. But that goes the same for everything we do in teaching. Like we're modifying everything we do, but
Mm,
we can't not check understanding. That
yeah,
I
yeah.
think we can let go of. I'm more than happy to let go of techniques, because there are just more than one ways to skin a cat. But I don't think we can let go of the big idea, the principle.
Well, that's such an important point. I mean, just more broadly, that I mean, I find out to articulate this constantly, which is the techniques aren't the law. Like they're just a framework
No.
for an idea. And it helps you push against your habits. And I've come across loads of teachers who find it really helpful to have these prompts and reminders. Oh yeah, I should do that. I should do that. But the should is only because it will make me think harder about what I'm doing. If people are kind of flexing it and all of that, which they always do, I think that's useful. One of the things techniques I want to talk about a bit was think, pair, share, because I'm currently obsessed with this because when you watch a lesson, it's the gap between the teacher's intention and what actually happens, sometimes it's kind of almost laughable. A teacher's like sets up this great question and then just says something like, okay, guys, so turn to your partner, have a chat about this, or come up, trying to come up with some ideas, and then they'll just go, off you go. And quite quickly, sort of kneel down and get involved with one of the conversations, and then it brings everyone together. And then they get some answers. So they'll feel like that went well. But what you observe in the corner is those four kids said nothing, or they just said one thing, or they said absolute nonsense to each other. And the teacher was over there, didn't notice that. And in their head thinking, I did a pair share. Actually, what he did was, that's like, it wasn't, everyone wasn't doing
Yeah,
it.
that was me at high school. My best friends and I had a lot to catch up on. I
Exactly.
mean, of course,
Yeah.
like this makes total sense.
And
I mean,
sometimes
at
it's sort of,
uni, when the tutor's like, all right, talk about that at tables, you're like, so anyway,
yeah, yeah.
when's the hour? Like, I mean, it's an adult thing. It would happen in our professional learning as well.
It would,
Like, I
exactly.
get people in my professional learning to turn and talk, and I walk past them and they're just like,
Which is where the
I don't
accountability
know.
comes in, and being ready to
Yeah.
answer afterwards, and being
Yeah.
ready to share, but also like literally training children to take it in turns. And I mean, so I'm a big fan of when you see teachers realizing they need this, they'll say, okay, I saw a teacher do it last week, sort of, okay, before we get going, A's, who are my A's, B's, who are my B's? And they said, okay, so remember, let's say this time B's go first, share your thoughts, listen to your partner, and be ready to represent your partner's answer when I call you at the end. And it was like they were so explicit about it. And they kind of like watched it happening before they went into support. But also the question had some substance to it where they had to just come up with, they had a resource to refer to as well. It wasn't just like winging it off the top of their head. So I felt like making it so that it's possible for the children to practice speaking and saying things. Whereas in
Yeah.
another lesson I saw recently, I suppose a classic example for me was just, I've used this example a few times, but there's a lesson where they were talking about graffiti and whether it was art or vandalism, and not potentially a great discussion. And I was well into it. It's like, wow, do I think that's art or vandalism? And so many interesting things to think about. But these two boys in front of me, they just were going, art. No, no, it's vandalism. No, it's art. It just We're just asserting their view like with increasing force with no reasoning or anything. And it was like, just give them a framework for this. They don't know how to do this conversation. So it makes you realize when you're listening in, sometimes
Mm.
it's quite sweet. Like the kids saying, another lovely one for me was a primary lesson where this teacher said, okay, I want you to come up with some adjectives to describe the character. Or not, no, she said, I want you to come up with all the words you're going to use to describe the character. So share with your partner, what words are you going to use? And there's two kids in front of me, they've said, let's use adjectives. Yeah, let's use adjectives. And that was their answer. And the teacher was like, and they're all like really pleased with themselves, but the teacher was obviously expecting them to just list tons of adjectives. Anyway, it's that type of thing. And I think, so what's the answer is almost anticipate that what you've asked might not happen and structure it and be conscious of it and check it's happening, all that kind of thing. Feels so boring, but it just has to be done.
Yeah. It's still so hard to do well though. I mean, yeah, I think pair share is super, super hard. And probably of all of the techniques that I see, probably um, the one that is most likely to drift into a total waste of instructional time.
Do you think so? Really? Wow.
Yeah.
But
Of,
would that
of,
mean that
of,
you?
of all the things, because I mean, mini whiteboards, right? You can have kids who don't have an answer or they don't want to chin their boards or whatever. But I mean, when you see kids sitting not knowing what to say, drifting
Yeah,
into off-task discussion.
yeah. So
I mean, off-task
would that mean you
discussion
wouldn't
is just
recommend it?
such a big one.
Would that mean that you wouldn't? Because I think that's a really interesting thing. So I've met people who think because they think it's so hard, they almost wouldn't do it or recommend it to people because of that risk. Whereas my view would be it's really important, and we just need to keep working on it. But I don't know. But I have had this exact discussions.
Yeah. Um, I think I'm a really, really big fan of kind of working the clock. I think that the time frame, I love sort of Doug Lemore stuff around working the clock and setting kind of irregular times. Like I often say to teachers, okay, with the task you wanted them to talk about, put your two most competent kids who are going to get onto the task really fast and stay on task. How long would they need? And often the teachers say, oh, 40 seconds, but you've given the class 3.5 minutes.
Mm.
So, okay, yep. If your top kids need 45 seconds, give them 67 seconds. Like, because then if they've faffed around, you've lost 60 seconds. You
Yeah.
know? Like, I just think like working the clock with pair share when you're getting it going, and if you then get evidence that you've got a sentence frame, you've got a nice, and also like, I know you write about this in walkthroughs, which I love, like constrain the task. The text on the board with the person next to you, find, 3 language
Yeah.
devices that the author is using
Yeah.
to persuade the audience. At the end, we'll share back as many as we can find. Go. So you got the accountability task, really short time frame and a constrained task. But I think my big problem with pair share is it kind of loses its cadence. It becomes like this lull kind of dead time and we're all
Yeah.
drifting. And then
It's
it's
got to be.
really hard to pull back. So you've got the minutes that you spent in the pair share, but then you've got the next minute transitioning back out. And once the kid's working memory is on something else, like that's why I think it.
Sometimes I feel like again, like you said, like you have to keep coming back to the purpose. So for me, the main purpose is, so let's say using vocabulary. If I want someone, and it depends on the age group a bit, but if I want kids to explain something like, I don't know, why does it rain or something, and you've explained it, um, you know, just getting them to sort of download that a bit, and sort of like you do in adult training, you say, okay, so I'm just going to pause for a minute for you to kind of like process that and talk it through. So you say, okay, so so we've explained it. So see if you can explain to your partner, and they've got some stuff to refer to. It shouldn't be just cold like blank page. It's using the stuff so that you're
Yeah.
hearing them say, the water condenses in the clouds or something, and you're practicing. And I think if without that, I can't think of in terms of responsive teaching, is that rehearsal phase of, now you can do some stuff chorally, but even then, like there's an accountability issue. So it's like it's all about the blend, isn't it? So a lot of the time I'm toing and froing with my instructional teaching, controlling it. But then you need to create the space for them to just go, okay, what do I think? But yeah, I think you're right. It can drift. So being conscious of it being blah, blah, blah. So it's so interesting. Like if when it works well, I think it's brilliant, but it has to be done with sort of real sharpness. Something I wanted to ask you about is whether you talk about loops, because in the world of responsive teaching, I feel like I found it helpful to talk about loops, which is
Yep.
this idea that we're inherently like teeing it up, seeing how it's gone, and then deciding what to do and responding, and maybe going again and then again,
Yeah.
and then moving on. And it's that the length of the loop can be, like you were saying with a cold call, like punch, punch, punch. It can be a little bit longer. And the longer the loop, the more material there is, the harder it is to actually check, because there's so much more variation in the room and so on. So short loops. And that I
Yeah.
feel like that's a kind of concept I feel we perhaps need to beef up a bit.
Yeah, I agree. So I kind of, yeah, it's not perfect, but I kind of talk about cycles of responsive teaching and that they're
Mm.
invisible, right? They're like under the surface and they're running throughout the lesson. And I kind of think like teach, track, respond, track, respond, track, respond. So, you're going teach, track, respond, but sometimes you're going teach, track thinking, how's it going, responding, track more, responding, track more, responding. So the track and respond, like, how's it going, respond, how's it going, respond, is kind of bubbling away there. But I also think it's really interesting to like something that I think I've undercooked in my work with schools, or like underappreciated, is the importance of having at least your core kind of checks for understanding planned in
Mm.
advance. It's
Yeah.
not revolutionary, but really rare, I think, to look at lesson level planning and for teachers to be sharing a core set of, checking for understanding. So I think it's also interesting on that idea of loops of like something I did about a month ago, which ended up, I think, being great and I need to do more of, is I worked with a team of health teachers at year 7. So in Australia, that's sort of, 13-year-olds. And they had a lesson on the 5 dimensions of health. So it was a physical health, emotional health, spiritual, can't even remember the other ones, social health and well-being. And I said, let's look across the lesson that you've got. How many of this teach, track, respond have you built in? Like how many moments can you see where you're teaching, then you're checking, and you're allowing room for the teacher to respond? And they counted 2 in a 60-minute period.
Ooh.
And so I said, all we're going to do together is we're just going to embed lots more of those. That's all we're going to do. We're going to keep the learning objectives going to stay exactly the same. We're going to keep the core content exactly the same. All we're going to do is just have more chunks where we're doing some intentional checking. Anyway, so then the health teacher ended up sort of presenting it to the whole staff, a bit of a before and after. And afterwards they counted 14. Oh, I've just given a thumbs up. After they counted 14 planned checks. And the main thing that the teachers were saying was, but how would you have time for that? Right. So it's like, but as soon as I stop and check that often, like I'm going to run out of time.
Yeah.
But there was one health teacher in the room who had taught with the new revamped lesson. And she said, yeah, we just had less time for the independent work at the end, but there was way more time for learning. So like she said it didn't take longer. It was just that there was more time with the kids thinking and the kids talking. And it was really simple stuff like, we'd stop and there'd be a slide and there'd be 4 true false questions. And it was, true false, so underutilized, right? Like super fast to write, lightning fast to mark. What you lose in a guessing pattern, 50% guessing pattern isn't great, but what you lose on that side, you gain in being able to do 7 of them or 8 of them or 9 of them at a time. And it was just really simple, really clear checks for understanding. And every now and then there was a really nuanced, tricky one thrown in, as a stretch kind of one. And it was interesting. Yeah, it was interesting to me that the teacher's takeaway would be that it's encroaching too much on time,
that comes up
even though the content was the same.
I want to use that as an example in my training now, because I feel like, you hear some like in Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction, he says, effective teachers invest more time in questioning and checking for understanding. And people often think, really? But he's saying, well, they led to better outcomes because of that. And that's exactly your example. That's amazing. So it's sort of, it isn't costly of time in the end because they're more on it. And I think that's
well, the other thing is that the independent task they had at the end, the teachers kind of reflected the task that the kids had to do at the end was imminently doable to a high standard with more checks for understanding in place. But in the first example, you would need 25 minutes of independent work because the kids would be stuck. So like the teachers are building in time to rove and help because the kids can't do the task. And it's like, nah, just spend more time
checking,
having the kids learn it, and then a little bit of time at the end with an independent learning task to check that they got it. But that's, I think, a big shift. But the really interesting thing was Chloe, her name was, she's a bloody gun. She said, when she had to present the before and after, she said, I don't want to show them the before. And I said, why not? I said, great content. Like you've planned the lesson. It's really clear learning objective, great content. And she said, I hate it. And I said, why? Why do you hate it? And she goes, because now that I'm checking understanding, I just hate it. I hate looking at it. She just like viscerally hated that she had planned. And I said, and the other thing I said to her was, which I don't know, I also think is true, is like, I said to her, yeah, but even though you hadn't planned those checks for understanding, you would be thinking on the fly of stuff to do. All you've done is been more intentional about it. And I think you've planned a much better lesson. And then a lot of the other teachers went, oh my God, I get it. I get what it looks like. Oh, you just teach a bit and then you check. You teach a bit and then you check. You teach a bit and then you check. But I think I don't know, it's a criticism of my own work with teachers is that I haven't really shown them many models of what it looks like to take the exact same learning objective, exact same core content, and plan for more responsive teaching.
That's a really good point. I mean, people are often wanting it to be put in their own context, and you're sort of inviting them to interpret it themselves. But that example you gave is gold. I was thinking so much there about some of the things that we've been talking about is so that to me is classic responsive teaching, and it's planned and thought about. In my codification, I'd call that would be the short feedback loops, and I'm already thinking, I wish I'd called it teach, track, respond, because that's way better. And it's kind of, I love the fact that it's kind of the same idea, like loops. But I think the way that you describe it is more explicit, that it's really quite short and it's got loops within it. And embedded in that for me is the challenge of checking all of the children, because it's like, systematically, like some checks are not systematically involving everyone. They're just a couple of answers, which can be okay, but it's sort of kids fall through the net. But isn't this interesting? So you've got that now. One of the questions we're going to ask you is, like, when you go in and you're doing your training, are you sort of saying, okay, guys, here's this technique. It's called teach, track, respond, and this is how you do it? Or are you sort of letting teachers think through it and then seeing what they come up with, and then sort of like keeping your codified version ready if they need it? Or do you feel like you're saying, look, do it like this because this works? How do you use the codified concept?
So currently, and I'm sure this will change, I kind of present teach, track, respond as kind of big ideas. Like teaching's really important. Tracking their thinking and checking understanding is really important, and responding is really important. I think it's most important to start with teaching and tracking because we can plan for those. I think responding is much harder to plan for. So I think responding, I'm doing less and less with schools, just because I think there's not much point focusing on that until you're checking all students' thinking, right? Like I wouldn't, that example I gave before of like scanning mini whiteboards and saying, oh, this is great, we've got variation here. Like I call that share variation. So the technique is share variation, and it's when I see helpful variation across a range of responses, and I'm going to anonymously share that variation with my kids and go through the variation and have them then correct. Yeah, you could focus on share variation, but what if you're not even using mini whiteboards yet, right? Like, so I think that techniques for tracking and checking thinking are so undercooked and underplanned for that it's cherry on the cake stuff to me. Like even error correction, like it's so important, but like, is it more important than checking all kids' thinking in the first place? No.
Yeah, so it's
like
a bit chicken and egg. And this is one of the things I find so interesting with this whole work is that it's a bit like I don't know, it's a bit like one of those outdoor, it's like one of those sort of team game things where everyone has to sit on everyone else's knees, as you sort of gradually down on a circle, and you have this circle of people all sitting on the lap of the person behind them, and it's a circle. It kind of only works if everyone does it. And I sometimes think that that's a bit like teaching. Like if you get that, and that, all four of those elements are mutually reinforcing, and then it all works better. But to get each one, you kind of need to break it down a bit, and then it feels a bit clunky.
So some school leaders will say like, I just want our teachers to differentiate more and to, give more feedback. And it's like, but there aren't any systems for checking all kids' thinking. So like, I think of like tracking and checking understanding as like where you start and where you invest a ton of energy, and just I just invest a ton of energy in that. Like same with the health teachers. Like once they had a few simple techniques, multiple choice, true, false, some closed-ended questioning, some stop and jot, take 20 seconds, jot this down, right? Let me check, some mini whiteboards, whatever it is. Then you're kind of in the flow and you're ready to think about stuff. So basically, I talk about teach, track, respond as being this kind of loop that's that we're aiming to get going. And I spend the vast majority of my training on tracking, thinking, checking, understanding,
Mm,
just because I think it's such good bang for buck. And
yeah.
also, I think it's easier to get granular with. So there are so many things that are so important. Like, here's an example, like explanation, right? Like crafting a good explanation. Chunking is really important. Live modeling is really important. Thought narration, think aloud. But those things are so parasitic upon the domain specifics. Like you can't really describe what a good explanation is generally.
No,
Whereas there are some topographical features of a mini whiteboard routine that I think truly are domain agnostic.
I
What
think
do you
that's
think
an
about that?
important point, is that you've got to know when it's good to do whole school training and when it's better to just say, like, this is subject specific. And I think like things like
Totally.
scaffolding is a broad concept, but until you're talking about specific scaffolds for a specific task, it gets a bit,
Yeah.
generic, and it doesn't
Yeah.
mean in it. And I feel like we could do a whole series of these conversations, because I feel like this is,
Yeah. We need to sequence out.
yeah, I feel like this is just the first conversation, and I'm thinking we've been going for nearly an hour, and we
Have
have
we?
barely
Oh
scratched the
dear.
surface. It's amazing. So I think what we should do is pause now, and then for people who've listened in so far, I hope you found it interesting, because I did. I've learned so much in the last hour talking to you. That's just amazing.
Yeah, it's been great. I think we need another sequence of conversations. And I'd love to chat to you about, which we wanted to talk about, we didn't even get to, this kind of idea of codification and what we can codify and
Okay, well,
what we
let's make a
can't
point
and the value
now
of that.
to. I'm going to stop recording, but then what we're going to do is we're going to do another one. Okay, you
Sounds
heard it.
good. Thanks,
You,
Tom.
you heard it here now, folks. Okay, thanks a lot, Bron. I'll stop recording now.